You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. And this week we are reading probably one of the more interesting, at least to me, one of the more interesting Haftarot, because this Haftarah has a very, very clear historical background, which unfortunately can be very easily missed. And the background is very complex. And there are many, many, many details which hide between the words. We are going to be reading the Haftarah for obviously Haftarah Toldot, and we're going to be reading from Malachi 1, verse 1, all the way to chapter 2, verse 7. The Yemenite tradition actually carries on all the way to chapter 3, but I'm not going to focus on that one. Because first of all, it makes everything very, very long, and second of all, the majority tradition is to read only until verse 7, even though verse 7 actually stops in the middle of a subject before the criticism really comes out. And the thing that really needs to be understood regarding the book of Malachi is that Malachi is at the end of prophecy, at the end of what we would call classic prophecy. And what do I mean by this term classic prophecy? So there was an ongoing argument during the Second Temple period if prophecy still existed in the regular way where you have a prophet like the prophets of old. And this debate, I would say, carries on to this very day as a debate between Judaism and Christianity. Well, we'll start off with the earliest stages and then we'll go to the latter stages. The problem that we have is that prophecy does become weaker and weaker in time. Earlier prophets, when they saw visions, First Temple prophets, or even earlier, when they saw visions, things were very, very direct. The metaphors were very, very direct. And the appearance of angels or different messengers was much more clear, and the function was very, very direct to their time. And in time, prophecy starts taking a form that becomes much more difficult to understand. And we do have many prophecies, like, for example, in Isaiah, which is a classic prophet, we call it. The thing that happens there is that there are prophecies in the book of Isaiah which are debatable and not 100% clear. And I agree with that. That's probably one of the issues with prophecy. But the more you progress in time, especially when you reach, for example, the book of Zechariah, the prophecies become even more muffled to a point where the prophet has to say, I don't understand. What is this thing that I'm seeing? Same thing happens also with the book of Daniel. It's very interesting. The book of Daniel was not added in the Hebrew Bible. It does not appear inside the prophets. And there could be some issue here with the book of Daniel, but this won't be the subject of our discussion here. But there was some debate going about the book of Daniel, probably to do with when it was written, how it was written, how authoritative it was in regards to prophecy. And this is why, out of suspicion, it was probably pushed into the Ketuvim. And yes, I understand my ears might go up like, what does that mean? I don't want to open that up here because it is a very, very difficult subject to answer. And many, many books have been written about how the Bible became the Bible and why certain books were rejected and other books were accepted and how books were pushed around. But what's very, very interesting is that prophecy becomes a lot more difficult to understand. Daniel as well, he goes on and says, I don't understand, what is this thing? And the angel tells him, you have to wait a certain amount of time, and so much ink has been spilled about understanding how that time calculation works, and different opinions about what exactly it means, and that's really what it is. That there are places where we can pinpoint an historical event when it comes to prophecy, and there are places that we can't. And then there's also the question of, is this something really to the future, or is this founded in something that was going on and was expected to happen at that given time. And there is literature on how prophecy works. And for example, there was an argument made by Oppenheimer in his book, Hanevuah K'duma, the ancient prophecy, where he examines the subject of prophecy and compares it also to prophecy of Israel versus prophecies which appear in other nations. And one of the arguments that he makes there is that prophecy, the main function of prophecy in the classic period was something directly for that time, but we also need to understand that, as some people say mistakenly, history repeats itself, though I have had a professor of history that said to me that history doesn't really repeat itself exactly. It kind of repeats itself because human beings do tend to behave in certain ways, but it's never exactly, so the statement is only partially true. And the thing that needs to be understood is that prophecy and prophetic writings do have an eternal message, which are relevant to our very day, because the things that they were suffering from, we suffer from today as well. And a lot of the dilemmas that we have today as modern people, they had back then as well. And what's very interesting about Malachi is that I can draw parallels between the period that he was describing, the period he lived in, and the period of the state of Israel today, where we're kind of trying to start off something new, but there's a lot of confusion about our relationship with other nations, our relationships amongst ourselves as different groups inside the Jewish world. And I read through it, and every time I read Malachi, it always reminds you of, like, let me try to see if I can understand something regarding our times as well, without trying to expect something to happen, but to try to draw in a message that has a much more eternal sense, a much more eternal meaning, something that as long as we are in a state where corruption is possible, to try to put this into us, to try to improve ourselves by learning from the past. And it's actually a very common thing amongst classically trained historians, as myself, for example, that we always learn the writings of Edward Gibbon, who wrote about the fall of the Roman Empire, massive work that he wrote. And he, in his more philosophical approach to certain things, says that historians are the guardians of mankind, because historians can point to events in history and say, you see that, don't repeat that, that's a mistake. And the saddest thing, by the way, is that we are repeating certain mistakes. We are confusing things. We are allowing erosion of society. Classic, traditional behavior is being killed again. Order is being taken away. Institutions are being destroyed because people just want to feel free all the time. But anyone who understands freedom also understands that freedom comes with a price. And responsibility comes with a price as well. I'm going to add this to this as well, because this is part of the discussion of what goes on in the book of Malachi. Being chosen means that you have a responsibility and a duty as well. You can't just walk around saying, oh, I'm chosen, that's it. That's one of the messages that we see in the other prophets as well, but Malachi stresses this as well. And we need to understand the period before we even go into this. And this is a period of turmoil. First of all, we have to understand that there were wars against the Persian Empire. This is post the declaration of Cyrus. This is post the return to Jerusalem, the return to Zion. And we need to understand that the communities living in the land of Israel at this point were heavily divided. And this division carried on for a very, very long time. And, for example, Professor Alexander Rofé wanted to even suggest that we find hints in the books of Zechariah and Malachi to some of the latter sectarian way of thinking that we might find in the Second Temple, and especially some divisions between the scribes, which were the fathers of the Pharisees, versus the Sadducees, which were priestly orders, and the Essenes, who eventually kind of broke off of society, more or less. I can argue that the jury's a little out on that one right now, if I may borrow an American term, because really society was in shambles. The destruction of the First Temple put a lot of the Jewish community, we call it the Israelite community, in distress. Post-traumatic stress syndrome. I always call Second Temple Judaism as post-traumatic stress Judaism. Even today, we can talk about being the underdog, always being felt persecuted no matter what happens. Seeing the people yelling out anti-Semitism, where a rational person will say that's not anti-Semitism. That's actually pretty good criticism sometimes. And today also the culture promotes this underdog mentality, which is very, very unhealthy in my opinion. It's not always wrong, but siding with the underdog is not always right either. And besides that, we have a problem that there are competitions with other groups sitting in the land who want to belong. And this is a conflict that exists to this very day about Jewish identity. Who qualifies as an Israelite? Who can be considered an Israelite? And that's really part of the difficulty that we're having there. And I actually did a recording several years ago about Second Temple Judaism and what was going on there. You can find it on the website. And the problem that they were having specifically here was that the priesthood, and we're dealing here with a complaint of God against Israel in the behavior of the people towards God and their trust in God. And this was a period where trust was very, very difficult, and also a complaint against the priesthood. Now, the people themselves, we're talking about almost, I would say, refugees who returned, or descendants of refugees who returned from the east, from the different areas they were exiled in. Not all were Judeans. I mean, there were a lot of people still living in the land. There's this classic way of looking at things today, where people think that the land was completely empty, and they cite certain verses to prove this, but there's actually more details that indicate from the Bible itself and from what we know from history that the land was not empty. Many descendants of the tribes were still living in the land, and that was part of the problem that we're living with, because there was a group, I would say almost an elitist group, that showed up and felt that they were the only ones who were holy, they were the only ones who were important, and a lot of people who stayed in the land, who had their own practices and traditions, saw this new group of 40-something thousand people show up over a period of time. This wasn't in one go. That's agreed upon amongst historians. That the number that we have, 42,000 and so on in the book of Ezra, was really an amalgamation of several periods that came together up to that number. But that's a pretty serious mass of people. And there was a struggle going on over identity, over the feelings that people had after the destruction of the first temple, especially the ones who were exiled. They were living amongst the nations. They weren't living in a homogeneous reality where they were still living on their land. Even though the temple was destroyed, they were still practicing a lot of things. There's a chance that people were still sacrificing to some degree. We see that in the book of Jeremiah, the men who came from Shechem, they were on Shiloh, they were on the way to Jerusalem. There were a lot of things that were still going on, and they were still living a much more Israelite mentality, while in the East, these groups were creating what you can call their Jewish identity, and they came with their, I would say, Jewish way of looking at things. And this is not saying that there's something wrong with Judaism, it's more of an issue of understanding a bit of what was going on there culturally. So they showed up, and when they came here, there was a clash of cultures. It's very similar, by the way, to what's going on, for example, between Jews and Americans, Jews and Israel, where we actually are two very distinct groups. We all follow very, very similar things, but the mentalities are very, very different. And this is why sometimes when American Jews come to Israel, they go into a certain level of culture shock, because Israeli Judaism is different, a bit harsher sometimes, more strict about certain things. And I would say even sometimes a lot more traditional, but this is not really a good place to open such a thing, because when you speak with American Jews, for example, the feeling sometimes is that they have the original form of Judaism, and it's really interesting to see basically history repeating itself. And and sometimes here in Israel, people feel as if they have the original, and there's been this struggle going on between, for example, the rabbinate and other rabbis outside of Israel, who has authority and so on. So this is the reality of diaspora. Now, when they came back, people were hoping for great things, and they were hoping for a massive redemption after 70 years of exile, and it didn't happen. It's, again, very similar to the cultural shock that a lot of people come to live in the land of Israel. The reality is that the streets are not paved with gold. You actually have to work very, very hard to get anywhere. And it's real life. It's not like, oh, I'm going to land here and everything's going to be fine. And as a son of people who immigrated to Israel back as the 80s began, My father and my mother came to Israel because they wanted to preserve their Jewish identity. And my father actually had the foresight of understanding what's going to happen in the land, what's going to happen in England, where he was born. He had the foresight to see what's going to happen and how Jewish identity in England was being eroded, and also the changes in society in England that makes England very unsafe sometimes for Jews. And my father came to Israel, but he knew he had to work hard. I mean, my family comes from a second class type of middle class workers, and people worked hard. And my parents didn't show up with money, and it's the same reality as Jews who were coming from, or Judeans, actually preferably called as Judeans, but Judeans who were seeking their old life back, seeking their identity. And wanting to return home. But when you return home, you have to understand that it's not like, oh, we're going to sit back and everything's going to happen. And when they came back, they came to a land that there were foreigners occupying it. There were people from other nations. Some of the forefathers of the Samaritans. The Samaritans were not only descendants of people who came from the east, but also some Judeans, and Josephus describes this very, very well. But these early stage Samaritans were also heavily involved in what was going on in Judea. They wanted a place, they wanted a footing. And to really get a very good background of all of this, you actually have to go back to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and see the struggles. And that's really the background of what Malachi is talking about. So you really have to read Malachi together with Ezra and Nehemiah to really get a good picture of what was going on. And the people complained. You go to the book of Haggai, and Haggai talks about the reality that they were unable to multiply their produce. Everything was destroyed. They were having hardship in developing the land, and there was actually a massive rebellion against the Persians, and they were stuck in the middle because they were very loyal to the Persians, but the other social groups wanted to rebel. They have aspiring people in the north, in Samaria, who are trying to get a footing in the temple. They started to marry with the priesthood, raising questions about the behavior of the priesthood. And this reality, a shattered reality, a broken reality, and I would say a broken reality that exists to this very day, because today we don't have a temple. We're not back on our 2 feet. We have a state of Israel, but the number of issues is great. I mean, it's amazing to be able to live after so many generations, to live back in the land of my ancestors, but it's also not without its problems. So, for example, my family were originally Jews who were exiled after the Second Temple to Greece. This whole story is that there were boats that were supposed to go to Rome with people who were captured from Judea, and they were taken, and some of the boats actually stopped in Greece, and several hundred Jews actually got off, and they stayed on the land, and they just stayed there. And my family basically started off there and moved northwards into, at one point, a border in Macedonia. And then somewhere around the 1600s, as far as we know, so 16 or 1700s, they migrated into Eastern Europe because there were financial opportunities there. Funny enough, my grandfather was a merchant. He was a textile merchant in Europe. But my family belonged to a community that was not part of the Ashkenazi Jews. This was some interesting discoveries that we had. And digging into the history of my family, I was able to find some interesting details. Like, for example, the rabbi of the synagogue where my grandfather used to pray actually had a stash of prayer books that were not Ashkenazi prayer books. They actually were Sephardic prayer books, which means that my family left Greece around the time after the Spanish Jews came to Greece and changed the community there. But the dream was, after so many years, after almost 2,000 years of exile, to return and live here. My parents lived here for many, many years, and I stayed. My parents eventually immigrated to the United States. And that's part of the shattered dream, that my parents couldn't make it here. So there's a very, when I read these words, it's very personal to me, because I'm trying to show that it is possible to live here in the land of Israel. And understanding the shattered dream, understanding this broken dream, but then also remembering that there's hope, going back to Isaiah and remembering that there's hope. And this is what the prophet starts telling them. There is hope. He says, I do love you. And the people say, well, what about Esau? What about Esau, who controls parts of our lands, which is part of what happened historically after the beginning of the erosion of the Judean kingdom? The Edomites started invading the southern areas of Judea and into the Judean plains, and people knew this. And Edom, the other brother, the brother of Jacob, of Yaakov, and they're saying you favor them over us because the Edomites were flourishing here in the land, and they were part of the enemies of Judea. And God says, no, I still love you. This is what he says to them. And now we're going to start reading. It says, Masa devar Adonai el Israel be'ad Malachi. So Masa means something to carry, which means the carrying of the voice. It's one possible interpretation of the word of the Lord to Israel in the hand of Malachi. And this is name Malachi. It comes from the word Malach, which means messenger. And I've made the argument in the past that sometimes we don't really know their real names. So here Malachi can be the one who is God's messenger, my messenger, even though the name can also be his real name. It says, Ahavti etchem, verse 2, Ahavti etchem, Amar Adonai, V'amartem, Bama ahavtanu. So he says to them, I love you, says the Lord. And you said, with what have you loved us? Proof to us that you loved us. Because emunah is based on the idea of proof. Now, anyone who's read the Bible knows he does love us. But in a point where a person is in darkness, in a broken state, it's very difficult for a person to see the light, to see the positive in their life. It says, Heloach esav li Yaakov neum Adonai, for Esau is the brother of Jacob, the word of the Lord. Ve'ohavet Yaakov ve'tesav saneti. Sorry, I jumped into the next verse because it feels like it should naturally go in there. But it says, and I love Jacob. However, in verse 3 it says, however, at Esau, I hate. V'asim et harav shemaman, I'll place his mountains as desolate. The mountains will be desolate. V'et nachalato letanot midbar, and his inheritance. Now, tanot can be jackals that run around, but it doesn't really work well with the word shmama, so tanot has to be some type of wilderness. And he says, verse 4, Kotomar Edom Rosheshanu v'nashuv livnei charavot. Ko amar Adonai Tzevaot hema yivnu v'ani erosu. Ki tomar Edom rushashnu. If Edom says we have been cleared out from the root rashash to take away everything, and we will return and build all the destroyed places, charavot, which means the ruins. Ko amar Adonai Tzevaot, thus says the Lord of hosts. Hema yivnu v'ani eros. They will build and I will destroy. The Karulem Gevul Rishan, they will be named, others will call them the border of wickedness. Va'am asher za'am Adonai Adolam, and the people which the Lord has poured his anger upon them for all times. Adolam, olam in the biblical Hebrew means forever, or a long time. So he says to them, even you see they're flourishing, but an enemy will come and destroy them. And even if they try to put themselves back up, so there's two things being said here. He's telling them actually Edom will be destroyed, and even if they try to rebuild themselves, they won't be successful. So he's not only telling them a hypothetical reality, he's also telling them this is going to happen. And it did. And today you can go to Bet Govrin, for example, an Edomite city, and see how the place is destroyed. Ve'enechem tirena, verse 5, and your eyes will see, V'atem tomru igdal Adonai ma'al gvul Yisrael, and your eyes will see, and you will say, out of praise, may the Lord increase, may his honor basically increase over the border of Israel. Remember, he mentioned they will call them the border of wickedness. Here, the blessing, the opposite. They'll say, blessed is the Lord who increases the border of Israel. But then he goes back to the criticism. He says, I made a promise. You will return. You'll be strong and you'll be fine. Don't fear. But now he says, but there's a problem. He says, Ben yechabed av ve'eved adonav. A son honors his father, and a servant his master. Okay, the word yechabed is mentioned in there's a bit of a poetry structure here. So this is what we call a parallel, where one word is missing in the second parallel, but you complete it because of what appears in the first one. So the word yechabed should be Ben yechabed av ve'eved yechabed adonav, but the word yechabed is omitted from the second sentence. But it's still the same principle. A son who honors his father and a servant his master. If I am a father, where's my honor? But now, because we complete the parallel, use a different word. It says, Im Adonim ani, if I am a masters. Now it's interesting, it says Adonim and not Adon. When referring to God, the same principle as the word Elohim, you pluralize the word to indicate honor. So it says, if I'm a master, really it's a pluralization. It really indicates a singular. But it should be, if you want to do a literal translation, it should be Adonim means masters. But in the sense, it really means singular. It's a masters in the sense of honor. If I am a master, where's my fear? Where's the fear of me? Amar Adonai Tzevaot lachem hakohanim bozeh shemi. Now he turns to the priest and says the Lord of hosts to you, the priest who dishonor my name. And they go, V'amartem b'ma vazinu et shemecha. They ask, how have we dishonored your name? How have we desecrated your name? I have to remember the priests are being held here under the thumb of Sanballat, who was the district leader under the thumb, the Pecha it's called. That's a Persian term. He was a district ruler under the Persians. And he had footing, as we can read in the book of Nehemiah. He had footing in the temple, and Nehemiah struggled against him. And one of the reasons he did this was because he wanted control. And when Nehemiah showed up as the Pecha of Judea, of Jerusalem, under the authority of the king, Sanballat felt that someone's overtaking his district. He's losing power. He's losing money. So he infiltrated, even before that, he infiltrated the temple. If instead Nehemiah showed up decades, almost 100 years, I would say, after the reestablishment of the first stages of the reestablishment of the temple. It took years. Nehemiah was more involved in reestablishing the city. But when he showed up, Sanballat was very worried. When he footing in the temple, he knew there was money there. So he was involved. So the priests were ill-treating the temple because of the pressure that they were having from the outside, but also because of the loyalty they showed them. And Nehemiah was basically, you can say, a person who saw more to the idea of rejecting outsiders, rejecting foreigners. And he rejects them, they do. And this was part of the debate going on at the time. Now, I think this debate has never been really fully discussed in Judaism, and everyone has their own opinion. But the complaint here is this influence has damaged the respect in the temple, the respect of God in the temple. And he says to them, you have desecrated and dishonored my name. So he said to them, Megishim, verse 7, Megishim is mizbachi lechem megoal. You present before my table, my altar, because sometimes you have a verse in Chizkiah says, this is the table which is before the Lord. I think it's Ezekiel. And he says to them, you're presenting before my altar unclean or stained, megoal from the word ga'al. It says megoal bedam, for example, stained with blood, so stained or unclean bread. With what have we stained? What have we made something inappropriate, desecrated? When you say to the table of the Lord, it is disgraceful. Now, what he's basically saying to them is that your behavior is a marker of your attitude towards me. You're supposed to bring to the temple things that honor me, but you're not. And by doing so, by your action, you are presenting as if my table is disgraceful. Now, if we go back to the story of Eli and his sons, it's a very similar thing. If you're going to bring to the temple broken animals, blind, and this is what he read. There are two things here. You, as the priest, disrespecting God, not showing the proper honor. But also, how does it educate the people that see this? That you're sending to Sanballat, and he points this out, you're sending to Sanballat all the good animals, everything that's worth eating. And to me, you're presenting these broken animals, these blind animals. And you're bringing this to the temple while you're taking care of yourself. This reminds us strongly of what happened with the sons of Eli in the book of Samuel, the book of Shmuel. It says, V'chite gushun, verse 8, V'chite tagishun iver lizboach en ra, when you bring forth a blind animal to sacrifice, and you say, there's no evil, there's nothing wrong here. V'chite gishu pisech v'chole en ra. And when you present something which is a limp or sick, and you say there's no wickedness, there's nothing wrong. And he says to them, bring it forth before Sanvelat, before your pecha. He says to them, would he find you pleasing or lift your face, make you important? Amar Adonai Tzevot, says the Lord of Hosts. So he says to them, you're ill-treating my temple. Everything that's wrong in your reality is because of you. Take responsibility of what you're doing. It says, it says, now turn, seek the presence of God, and He will give you favor. From your own hands was this. This is your problem. This is your fault. Would He lift face? Would He exalt you? Would He show you favor? Amar Adonai Tzavot, the Lord of Hosts says. When reading this verse, I feel that it's a little disjointed, because in the first part He says, turn to the Lord, seek the Lord, and He will give you favor. But then He says to them, maybe as a response, He says this to them, and they're like, we're not too sure. Sometimes prophecies can be disjointed because of the fact that we're not reading just one thing, we're reading two things. Where He says this to them, and He sees on their faces that they're not interested. Like, for example, Jeremiah, when he warns the people who are fleeing down to Egypt, and He says to them, and He notices that they're not interested, so He gives a different response. This might be it. He says, this is from your hands. He will not lift your face. He will not show you favor. So we're seeing a request and then a response to the refusal. So He says to them, who needs your temple? I'm not interested. If you're not going to do this right, I'm not interested. Who from you will also close the doors of the temple, and he will not curse my altar for nothing. I have no wish from you. I don't want you, said the Lord of Hosts. And an offering, even a grain offering, because the mincha is mostly identified with the grain offering, I will not want from you. Your attitude is completely wrong towards me. And He says to them in contrast, and this is a fascinating verse. I've been asked about this verse many times. He says, says from the east of the sun, where the sun rises, until the place where it enters, the west, my name is great amongst the nations. Yes, what do you mean my name is great amongst the nations? So Dr. Nili Vazana, which I actually had to use her material for a different study that I did, indicates that there might have been a group of worshippers of the God of Israel already established in the north in Syria under Naaman. He started a cult of the God of Israel. But also with the exile, nations were exposed to the God of Israel. They heard the stories, which means that there were probably many worshippers of God out there, which is interesting. This might be Malachi taking a side, arguing that no, we actually want outsiders as part of the worshippers of the God of Israel. The priests, say, we're the priests, but you're doing everything wrong. And he says, on the other hand, there are all these nations that praise me. He says, "Uvechol makom muktar mugash lishmi umincha teora." In every place there's burning, muktar. Something is burned, maybe incense. There was this argument that people were sacrificing in different nations to the God of Israel. And it is offered to my name, and a clean grain offering. He says, they're doing everything right, you're doing everything wrong. He says, Ki gadol shemi bagoyim amar Adonai Tzavot, for my name is great amongst the nations, is the Lord of Hosts. However, va'atem, and you, mechaelim oto, you are desecrating it. Be'omrechem shulchan Adonai mego'alhu, for you say that, when you say that the table of Adonai, it's interesting, it doesn't use the name here. And I'm checking different variations of the text to see if there's anything that might indicate something different. It doesn't seem to be. So it's interesting, he uses the term Adonai, which a lot of people jump and say, oh, it got replaced, or people say, oh, where does his name Adonai comes from? But it was one of the names of God. It means Lord, Master. For the table of the Lord is defiled. V'nivon nivzeh ochlo. This has always been a difficult thing to explain, what nivon nivzeh ochlo. However, it probably means that anything which is placed upon it, and anyone who eats from the sacrifices is nivzeh, is hated. Verse 13, V'amartem hine metala'a v'ipachtem oto, amar Adonai Tzevot. And you said, behold, this is something which is tiring. And he says, v'ipachtem oto. When you feel tired and you're making a face, some people say that the hipachtem is the idea of blowing out air out of your mouth with a type of like with puffing up your cheeks to show that you're displeased with something. And by doing so, you're showing dishonor and disrespect to the altar. It says, Ve'vetem gazul v'tapisech v'tachole, and you bring that which you have stolen, and the limp and the sick. Ve'vetem et mincha, and you brought the grain offering. Ha'irtze oto, would I want it? Ha'irtze oto mi'yedchem amar Adonai, would I want it from your hand, says the Lord? And it says, Ve'arur nochel ve'esh be'edro zachar, and cursed is a crooked person who is a crook, and he has in his herd a male animal. V'noder ve'zovach moshchat la'Adonai, and he vows and he sacrifices that which is defiled, that which has blemishes to the Lord. Ki melech gadol ani amar Adonai Tzevaot ushmi nora v'goyim, for I am a great king, says the Lord of hosts, and my name is terrible amongst the nation. Terrible really means in this sense great. And he says, you have these kings, I sent Cyrus to release you. I am in control of all these different kings. I am the great king. Because by this point, kings were referring to this, well, actually even prior to this, kings were referring to themselves as the great kings. But this was the age of the empires. And kings refer to themselves as kings and so on. And God says, I am a great king. And you have to show me respect the same way you show respect to these kings that I sent to redeem you. It says to them, Ve'ata alechem ha-mitzvah hazot ha-kohanim, and now to you this commandment, the priests. Im lo tishmi'u v'im lo tasimu alev latet kavod lishmi, amar Adonai Tzevaot. If you not heed to my words, and place upon your hearts, where in the ancient world they believed the thoughts were, to give honor to my name, says the Lord of hosts. V'shilachti v'chem ata me'eran, I will send against you the curse. Va'aroti et birchotechem, and I will curse your blessings. Because priests are supposed to be a source of blessing. They're supposed to be able to have the power to place a blessing in the name of God upon people. V'gam aroti ki enechem saim alev, and I will also curse it, for you're not placing upon your heart. There's a responsibility in being chosen. There's a responsibility in being a leader. When a leader misleads, he breaks his promise and he breaks his responsibility towards God and towards the people. And this is his complaint, and he points this out. And he says later on in the verses, he points out the idea that you have the responsibility, for you are my messengers. And this is probably why Malachi is referred to as the messenger. It says, and this reminds me a lot of the book of Chagai, and he says, Hini go'er lechem et hazera, for I am pouring my wrath, and ligo'ol means to yell, to show a wrathfulness and to speak harsh words. But here it really means to almost like as if yelling at it so it turns rotten. It says, Hini go'er lechem et hazera, for I am expressing my anger towards your seed. It says, V'zereti feresh al penechem, and I will pour, in truth, peresh here really means the content of the intestines, upon your face. Peresh chagichem, the content of the intestines of your feast, of the animals you bring for the feast. V'nasa etchem elav. And he says, and he will be carried to him. Now, there's a bit of a difficulty explaining these verses. And either you will be presented thus before Sanvelat, you're presented in a disgrace, covered with dirt. And if I remember correctly, the book of Malachi points out the idea. Sorry, the book of Zechariah should be chapter 3, if I remember correctly. I'm checking very, very quickly. But Zechariah chapter 3 talks about Yehoshua, the high priest, and his clothing, lavush begadim tsoim, which is translated as covered, wearing clothing which are dirty, but tsoim really refers to the word tsoah, which is the material in the bowel and the excrement. And he's pointing this out. And he says very similar to what Zechariah says. But there's a question here, what is it? V'nasa etchem elav? It's very, very unclear. But there's a version that says, V'nasati etchem me'alai, and I will carry you and basically throw you away from my presence. And that actually makes the version much simpler to understand. It says, V'da'atem ki shalachti alechem et ha-mitzvah azot, and you will know that I sent to you this commandment. Liyot beriti et Levi amar Adonai Tzevot, to be my covenant with the Levite, says the Lord of hosts. So there's a covenant with the Levite where there's a responsibility in regards to the temple. And he's telling them, you have your responsibility, and you will know by my response to your behavior if you're upkeeping the covenant or not. Beriti ata ito, my covenant was with him. Hachaim v'ashalom, the life and the peace, which reminds me a lot of the ending of the book of Deuteronomy. Behold, they present before you the good and the life. So he uses the word peace here, v'ashalom, which actually, reminds me also again of the priestly blessing, v'asem lecha shalom. So there's a lot of hints here all around. Ve'etenem lo mora v'yira'eni, and I will give him fear, and he will fear me. Out of the responsibility and the understanding of this covenant, they will fear me. Umpene shemi nichatun, before my name, he falls forward, he bows down with fear. Which, by the way, this verse might have been a source for the idea during the Second Temple, that when the high priest would say the name of God during Yom Kippurim, people will bow down onto their faces. But the name of God, when we hear it, should put fear and respect in our hearts. So running around using God's name everywhere is not necessarily something that's simple, but there's a really interesting discussion regarding the usage of the name during the Second Temple, during the First Temple, because people used it in letters and they spoke it all the time. But there's a mentality where you have to show your respect, so this running around saying God's name wherever you want is forbidden. Because the name is supposed to put fear. My name is great amongst the nations. Which, by the way, relates also to an issue that during the beginning of the Second Temple, people were actually moving away from using the name. And I think I discussed this somewhere else, but maybe it would be worthwhile doing a podcast that really goes into the history of why the name is not spoken amongst Jews. And the history is a lot more complex than most people realize, because some of the material that discusses this is a little obscure to most people. And then he says in verse 6, Torat emet hayta befiu, a truthful Torah, truthful instructions were in his mouth. And he gave truthful instructions to people. Ve'avla lo nimtza b'sfatav, and crookedness or something which is wrong is not found in his lips. Beshalom u'v'mishol halachiti, in peace and in a flat place, mishol from the word yashar, straight. He walked with me. Ve'rabim hishiv me'avon, and many he brought back from sin. The priests, the Levites and the priests, their job is to instruct the people, to bring people back into Torah, to show people the right way. This is the ideal. This is what a priest is for. And he says, and we always end these readings with something positive, even though it carries on in a negative. It says, Ki siftei Kohen yishmeru da'at, for the lips of the Kohen will keep knowledge, will keep the wisdom. V'torah yevakshu mipiu, and instruction, Torah, they will seek from his lips. Ki malach Adonai Tzevot, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. The priest is depicted here in the white clothing as an angel, as a messenger of God, who's supposed to represent God, not defile the temple, not disrespect God. An angel who stands in the heavens before God, anything God tells him to do, he runs forward and does it immediately with no questions, with no debates, with no discussions. And he says the priests used to be like this. And he's basically saying to them, also yearning on the past, remembering the past, where he says, in the past, the priests were a blessing to the people. They were a blessing through doing God's will. They did the right thing. And we hear, actually, when we look, for example, during the times of King Yoash, Yehoiada, the high priest, made sure the temple was done correctly. And while he was alive, the temple and the king were working together. And he made sure everyone followed the Torah. And he says, this is your responsibility. Now, why does he stress this so much? Because even though there was Zerubbabel and others, but specifically Zerubbabel, who was supposed to be a descendant of the house of David vanished. Zerubbabel, if you pay close attention to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, he only appears a little bit and then he vanishes, he kind of fades into the background because the house of David didn't have the power anymore. And he says to them, it's your responsibility during this period. If you go to the reporting I did about the Second Temple, you can actually see how the high priesthood and the priesthood became the leaders. And he says, if they're corrupted, there's no leadership anymore because prophecy is slowly dying out. And Malachi is considered to be the last prophet. And during this period, people were still looking for prophecy, kind of closing up with what I started with. In this period, where prophecy seems to be dying out, there were many people who were claiming to prophecy. There are many people who claim to prophecy even today. Judaism says, well, there's a bit of a, what you can call it, Holy Spirit. You could call it, though the term is very misleading, but that there are righteous people who have the ability to sense what God wants, but it's not pure prophecy. Well, in Christianity, following a much more, I would say, a seen way of things, because the Pharisees said prophecy is dying out, prophecy no longer really exists in the classical sense, and the Essenes said it still exists, and there's a lot of interesting lines between the Essenes and Christianity. And he's standing there and he's telling the priests, you're in charge. Because we're not going to really exist anymore. There's no king of David. There's no house of David. There's no king of the house of David. Prophecy is not going to be like it was. This is all on your shoulders. He's warning them. He's telling them, you're the last line of defense. If you're not going to do this right, then no one's going to do this right. And he says to them, my name is Malachi. You are like the Malach. When prophecy fails and there's no king, the last line of defense is the priests and the Levites to instruct correctly. So that dramatic note, I want to thank everyone for joining me again. Don't forget that you can support what I do here through the donation button. But more importantly, share with your friends, discuss things. Even if you disagree, it's perfectly fine. I always say it's perfectly fine to disagree. I sometimes touch on subjects which are a little bit controversial. I don't go in too deep into them. But this question of prophecy I've been asked many, many times. Maybe eventually I should do something much more complex about prophecy to try to discuss it. But again, we need to look to the Torah, see the instructions, and do things correctly. Because even today the priests don't have the power they used to. And I, as a Levite, who even recognizes what my authority is? So the only thing we're left to do is to look to the Torah and see what it says. The absolute final line of defense. Unless my other Levite and priest brothers will stand up and start doing our work, and I'm trying to teach and instruct. Until then, until we reestablish the structures, the only thing we're left with is looking to the Torah. That is the last, final line of defense. But it has hope, and the hope is there, because we still have the Torah, and priests and Levites are still there. And I'm pretty sure there are people out there who have some ability close to prophecy. And there are descendants of the house of David out there still. So there is hope. Never lose hope. As I spoke a lot in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah is about hope. Don't lose hope. For there are messengers of God out there. So thank you again for joining me. Kol Tov.